The Mirage III was one of the most consequential combat aircraft of the Cold War. It put France on the map as a maker of advanced combat aircraft, and its capabilities were a major factor in Middle Eastern air warfare throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s. I've covered the Mirage IIIC in a lot of detail in the Shahak video, but that left a lot of the story untold. This video therefore covers the rest of the various versions of the Mirage III, in particular the E, the R Reconnaissance variants, the Mirage 5, and the 50. In order to prevent running over old ground, I'll keep the origin story to a minimum this time. Likewise, detailed discussion of the Mirage IIIJ and its combat record. The Cheetah, the Nesher, and the Kafir are quite different aircraft and not in this run-through. Likewise, the vertical lift and variable geometry experiments. All of that said, let's get into it. The Armée de l'Air entered the jet age when they began operating British de Havilland Vampires in 1948. These were then license-built as the Mistral, starting in 1951. But what France wanted was a jet fighter industry of its very own. In 1952, they finally got what they'd asked for in the form of the dumpy, slow, and on occasion downright dangerous Dassault Ouragan. Marcel Dassault was a towering figure in Cold War aviation. Under contract from the Air Ministry, Dassault next fitted a fully swept wing to the Ouragan. With many other modifications, he shipped the disappointing Mystere II in 1954, and shortly afterwards the far more potent Mystere IV. These types were supersonic in a dive, and the final development of the Mystere line, the Super Mystere, was supersonic in level flight. But radarless, cannon-armed day fighters were rapidly being rendered obsolete by developments on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The Armée de l'Air was quick to realise this, and in 1953 they embarked on an ambitious program to develop an interceptor capable of at least Mach 2 and able to climb above 60,000 feet within a few minutes of launch. Their targets were predicted to be Soviet supersonic high-altitude bombers. But this specification was science fiction next to what French industry could actually build. The SNECMA organization and its German designers were developing a line of jet engines, but in 1953 these were completely unproven. An afterburner was yet to fly in French service. So the Armée de l'Air asked for their new interceptor to combine a powerful liquid-fueled rocket motor for the initial intercept, supplemented by a jet engine to enable the fighter to engage the enemy and then return to base. Dassault was one of 4 French designers to submit a proposal against this requirement. To reduce drag further than that of the Mystere, Marcel elected to fit a radical 55-degree delta wing to his new interceptor, alongside a large triangular fin. At this stage, he was not willing to take the intimate step of giving it a new name, so he referred to the aircraft as the Mystere Delta, or MD-550. Although the Ouragan and the Mystere were both single-engined, Dassault's intention was to power the Mystere Delta with a pair of Turbomeca Gabizo afterburning turbojets, each with about 2,400 pounds of force. These were unavailable when the time came to build a prototype, so the MD-550 was powered by a pair of Armstrong Siddeley Vipers, each producing a modest 1,753 pounds of force. A SEPA 66 liquid-fueled rocket in its detachable pack added another 3,300 pounds, giving a total of just over 6,800 pounds of force for 80 seconds. The Mystere prototype weighed 11,620 pounds empty and 14,200 at takeoff weight. It was about 38 feet long. Mystere Delta was actually a lot lighter than its predecessor. It weighed only 7,300 pounds empty and 11,170 at takeoff. Some of the weight loss was in engines, as a pair of Vipers weighed half as much as a Rolls-Royce Tay. Being centrifugal, the Tay was also a bit chubby, so the smaller Vipers also made the aircraft slimmer. Mystere Delta was 36 feet and 5 inches long and had a wingspan of 24 feet and 11 inches. Wing area was a modest 292 square feet. Rather than having a single large nose intake like the Mystere, these small engines were fed through cheek intakes. That allowed a needle-like nose to be fitted. Although it was a major departure from Dassault's usual conservative formula, it wasn't actually the first time he and his team had used the cheek intakes. The night fighter version of the Mystere had a similar arrangement in order to allow a radar dish to be fitted in the nose. MD-550 had two engines from the start, but because of the engine change, new air intakes were needed, delaying the first flight until the 25th of June 1955. On that day, at 8:50 in the morning, Roland Glavany eased the slender aircraft off the tarmac for the first time. After a few flights, he got the prototype up to Mach 0.95 in a shallow dive. It had neither rockets or afterburners and therefore was rather underpowered. Over time, Dassault realized that the big delta fin was preventing higher speeds being reached. He therefore replaced it with a smaller fin that was swept on both surfaces. Later, the rear fuselage was also recontoured to improve airflow. Towards the end of its first year of testing, the aircraft was stripped down for a major refit. Afterburning versions of the Viper were fitted, built under license in France and fitted with Dassault's own afterburner. Because the more powerful aircraft was expected to be hitting higher speeds, the intakes were made smaller to reduce drag. Although the afterburners would help, confidence in higher speeds was mainly due to the fitment of the SEPA 66 rocket motor for the first time. It was now that Marcel Dassault decided that it was time for a new name for his project. He decided on Mirage. MD-550 became Mirage I. Weight increased, but performance was good. With the afterburning jets alone, it got to Mach 1.3. With the rocket, it made Mach 1.6 in a shallow dive, which was much better than the original combination, but well short of what the Armée de l'Air wanted. Because the engines were small, they weren't going to be able to get the aircraft up to Mach 2, and because the Mirage I itself was small, it could only carry a single air-to-air missile as armament. The absolute best that such an aircraft could deliver was to kill one incoming bomber, and that's if everything worked correctly. The original program was therefore cancelled in the fall of 1956. Despite this, Mirage I was an essential step towards the eventual Mirage III. Dassault was already working on that aircraft. He'd seen information about fuselage profiling using the area rule supplied by the US. He'd also seen flight test data from the British Fairey Delta II, which gave him precious insight into delta wing shapes. And he'd seen the specifications for new and more powerful engines coming out from the French and British industries. He was using the products of both of those in his Mysteres. At this stage, though, Marcel still intended to use a pair of engines in his new interceptor, either the Gabizo or an uprated Viper. The short-lived Mirage II concept did away with the rocket, lengthened the fuselage, and had more power, but it still looked to be limited to about Mach 1.5. Alongside the disappointing calculations, early success with Snecma's Attar caused Dassault to reconsider his engine choice. He had fitted a 10,000 plus pound force Attar 101G to two of his Mystere 2 prototypes, and although their woeful aerodynamics prevented them from being particularly fast, the engine was obviously sound. A small team of 62 people worked on his new aircraft, with its 5-foot longer area-ruled fuselage and even racier 60-degree delta wing. Prototype 001 of the Mirage III flew for the first time on November 17, 1956, after an incredibly rapid development period. The Mirage III went back to the dual-mode propulsion system, with the SEPA 66 rocket hung under the rear fuselage. A jettison system was fitted in case the pilot needed to get rid of the motor in a hurry. On the 10th test flight, the rocket was used to propel the sleek Delta Mirage to Mach 1.52 at 38,000 feet. Although the initial signs were promising enough for the Armée de l'Air to order 10 pre-production aircraft, the first runs were actually a bit of a disappointment to the design team. They had anticipated that area ruling would lead to less supersonic drag. It turned out that the issue stemmed from poor control of the speed of the air that was entering the intake, which limited engine power. This was a common problem at the time. Many designers solved it with carefully designed fixed shock cones that slowed the air sufficiently in a designed flight regime but were compromised elsewhere. Being French, the Dassault team went for a more innovative and intricate solution. In the Mirage III, the shock cones can traverse forwards or backwards depending on the aircraft's speed. This was initially controlled by the pilot, but it was later automated based on readings from air pressure sensors in the intake. The team called them souris or mice because they poked their heads in and out of their holes. The effect on performance was instant. The Mirage III hit Mach 1.89 on October 2nd, 1958. The first pre-production Mirage IIIs incorporated ththese aerodynamic changes in an enlarged airframe that could carry the avionics necessary in a combat aircraft. Most notable was the longer 46-foot 6-inch fuselage that incorporated a radar in the nose. Wingspan was now a shade under 27 feet and wing area had climbed from 312 to 375 square feet. Later in development, a pronounced fillet would be fitted at the front of the fin, giving the Mirage its distinctive profile. Desire to compete for the Luftwaffe's requirement for a Mach II class fighter bomber led to Dassault incorporating air-to-ground weapons carriage options into the Mirage IIIA prototypes. Although the lack of a working radar and various other incentives led to the Luftwaffe choosing the F-104 Starfighter, adding some multi-role capability into what had hitherto been simply an interceptor would prove to be a good decision in the decades to come. The Mirage III's air-to-ground capability was in the form of its powerful cannons, or rocket pods, including the interesting JL-100R combined fuel tank and rocket pod, which had 18 SNEB rockets in the nose of a drop tank. Alternatively, a pair of 1,100-pound bombs, 500 kilos in new money, could be carried, one under each wing. I've covered the Cyrano radar before in some detail, so I won't repeat myself here. Suffice to say that Dassault's original intention had been to fit an in-house designed radar and fire control system. This proved to be beyond the company's capabilities, leading to the fitment of a 200 or 300 kilowatts, sources differ on that, Cyrano 1 bis radar, which operated in the X-band and was used for all-weather interception and continuous wave guidance of the single Matra 530 missile that the Mirage could carry beneath its fuselage. The Cyrano also provided the firing solution for the CSF gun sight that directed the cannons. In operation, this miracle of 1950s electronics was a bit finicky. It was tube-based, and those 30 tubes didn't particularly appreciate high-G maneuvers. The auto-tracking technology was not fully developed even when the Mirage entered service. Its propensity to lose lock earned the set the nickname Tefal, after the maker of non-stick cookware. Worse still, the radar's inability to pick out targets against ground clutter rendered the gun aiming features borderline useless. But even so, when it all worked, it was pretty decent as an interceptor radar, and in fairness, even the more developed US sets were hardly paragons of reliability at this stage. As I said, gun aiming was via the CSF-95 sight, which looked a bit like a head-up display but wasn't one in the true sense. The guns were a pair of DEFA 30mm revolver cannons with 125 rounds each, and most Mirage IIIs also had a pair of underwing pylons for Matra Magic short-range IR missiles. For pure interception missions, the tray containing the guns and ammunition could be removed, and a SEPA 66 or 841 rocket fitted under the rear fuselage. Needless to say that this was rarely done in practice, as the cannons proved to be the Mirage's most potent weapons. Long before the radar was ready, the first 3A prototype had flown for the first time on May 12, 1958. It was now powered by a much-developed version of the ATAR called the ATAR 9, which featured a lightened 9-stage compressor stage rather than the earlier 7-stage unit, a 2-stage turbine and much-enhanced multi-position afterburner nozzle. It gave 13,225 pounds of thrust. As made, the Mirage 3C weighed 12,350 pounds empty, or 22,860 at maximum takeoff. Thrust to weight at normal combat loading was therefore around 0.7 to 1. To shorten the Delta Wing Mirage's rather long landing run, a braking parachute was now fitted at the base of the fin. The 10 test articles flew throughout the second half of 1958 and 1959. By this point, the Army d'Air had already turned its interest in the program into a concrete order for 100 Mirage 3Cs in August 1958, and followed that up with 62 Mirage 3B 2C trainers. Manufacturing these aircraft was a significant undertaking. The Ouragan, Mystere, and Sud Aviation's Voiture were still quite simple products in terms of the materials they used and the precision with which they needed to be made. It was in making the Mirage III that the foundational industrial capabilities that have underpinned the French aviation industry to this day were set up. In order to service the French orders and later export customers, Dassault were forced to subcontract much of the manufacture to various companies around the country. In turn, these aviation companies would gradually surrender their own hopes of ever building a complete aircraft of their own in order to profit from the subcontracting work. The Mirage was therefore also in some ways the end of a competitive aviation industry in France. The Armée de l'Air received their first aircraft on the 7th of July 1961. By December, Escadron de Chasse No. 1 of the 2nd Fighter Wing had received its full complement of 15 Mirage IIICs. 95 of the aircraft were in service by November 1964. In 1962, the first Mirage IIIB arrived. Because of the Mirage's exceptional performance and unusual layout, the Armée de l'Air had ordered plenty of the two-seaters. They were quite different to the C, but also combat capable, although provision for the rocket motor was removed in the production versions. Cannons could be fitted, but rarely were in practice. Making a B meant stretching the fuselage of a C by a foot behind the pilot. This allowed the radio bay behind the cockpit in the single-seater to be enlarged. The radio equipment was relocated to the nose. This was a compromise on the B. It had no radar and thus no Matra 530. The lack of the main radar meant that a CSF-295 gun sight was fitted instead of the Cyrano-slaved CSF-95. The instructor sat behind the student. His seat was raised about 8 inches to improve his visibility forward and to allow the nose wheel to retract fully. All told, the Mirage IIIB was 32 inches longer than the C. 26 of them went to the Armée de l'Air for training supporting the tactical squadrons. 10 were assigned to the strategic forces as air-to-air refueling trainers supporting the Mirage IV squadrons. Later on, there were 10 Mirage IIIBEs, which were two-seat variants of the definitive Mirage IIIe. As well as the Armée de l'Air, Israel was an early customer for the Mirage IIIC, eventually receiving 70 Mirage IIICJs, 2 of the CRJ Reconnaissance variants, and 4 two-seaters. Israeli requirements and experiences thus somewhat shaped the early Mirage. Although the 3C was impressively dynamic, its focus on air defense, complicated systems, and poor ergonomics meant that relatively few other export orders were received. The other significant 3C customer was South Africa. They ordered 16 CZ fighters, which arrived between 1962 and 1964, and 3 two-place BZs, which arrived just after the fighters in 1964. Later, they'd also purchased 4 RZ reconnaissance aircraft, arriving in 1967. One of the reconnaissance aircraft was shot down by ground fire over Angola in 1979, with the pilot successfully ejecting and evading capture long enough to be rescued by friendly forces. Later, the South African Air Force also took delivery of 17 fighter bombers based on the Mirage IIIE and designated EZ, and they would develop the Cheetah subvariant, which seems like a good segue into discussion of the main Mirage III variant. Although Mirage IIIC was well liked in France, it had its limitations. As mentioned, the 3C could carry air-to-ground ordnance, but it only had 4 underwing hardpoints, and only the inboard ones were rated for heavy weapons. With those loaded with bombs or rockets, the 3C only had its internal fuel, which limited combat radius to less than 250 miles. The aircraft's avionics were also regarded as unreliable, which is hard to argue. In order to remedy these issues, Dassault was asked to develop an enhanced Mirage. The redesign was based around a similar fuselage plug to that found in the two-seat B. 11.8 inches was added to the fuselage behind the cockpit, but instead of putting in an extra seat, the radio bay was expanded to make space for more avionics and a larger fuselage fuel tank. The avionics were also completely overhauled. Out went valves and in came newfangled silicon transistors. Reliability jumped. The new Cyrano 2 radar was a 200 kilowatt set with a steerable antenna, but it ran significantly cooler and was much more robust than the Cyrano 1 bis. The antenna was now a Cassegrain type and it was connected to a brand new electromechanical fire control computer. This unit was quite fascinating. It could accept pre-programmed punch cards via a slot in the cockpit, enabling the pilot to run different programs depending on the changing tactical situation during a mission. The computer also provided navigation information based on preloaded maps and information that came from the new CSF Marconi Doppler radar under the nose. Although it didn't have automated terrain following, the radar did give the pilot far more information about the ground below at night and thus enabled lower level penetration in all weather conditions and at night. The radar also enabled accurate speed and drift data to be used for more accurate navigation. The navigation system itself was updated over that in the Mirage III-C, with improved gyros and better sensor integration. It was not, however, an inertial system, as that technology was not ready in time. TACAN was, however, fitted. The upgrades to the navigation system were the most significant capability upgrade that the 3E had over the 3C. It could now reach and find its target through heavy defences in all weathers and at all times of day. A new tail warning receiver added to its survivability. Cockpit ergonomics were also much improved to make the 3E less stressful to fly over long distances at low level. Similar improvements were made in the engine, which produced 13,670 pounds of force, but did so with improved fuel economy by way of a more precisely controlled 18-petal nozzle. The intention was to add 2 roles to the Mirage's repertoire, and examples of both of these types were ordered in 1960. First up was Tactical Nuclear Strike. The 15-kiloton AN-52 Special Store would be carried on the centerline, which meant altering the angle of the main landing gear legs so that they could retract with the bulky store in place. To enable carriage of larger conventional weapons load, the wing root structure was bulked up. Up to 8,800 pounds of external stores could be carried, but the slender dimensions of the wing and fuselage made fitting that much ordnance onto the airframe somewhat challenging. Once again, the French designers came up with an integrated solution and developed a 500-litre fuel tank that also had racks for 4 570-pound bombs. The improved avionics package also added carriage of the AS-37 Martel anti-radiation missile, as well as the latest variants of the Magic and Sidewinders. This extensively modified fighter bomber version was the Mirage III-E. Empty weight increased to 15,500 pounds, maximum takeoff weight was just over 30,000. Maximum speed remained 1,460 miles an hour or 2.2 Mach, albeit the prodigious rate of fuel consumption required to accelerate to those speeds would have led to a very short mission duration. Combat radius with a typical weapons and fuel load was about 375 miles. There was no provision for in-flight refueling. The second new mission was Tactical Reconnaissance. This, incidentally, was a role that the Israelis had already employed their C models for, by way of a range of interesting different interchangeable camera noses. The Mirage III-E could also carry camera pods, but these didn't provide the full range of capabilities that the Army de l'Air was seeking. For reasons of speed and cost, the dedicated 3R was fitted with the same basic avionics as the 3C rather than the new suite in the 3E. Removing the radar removed most of the maintenance headaches that came with the older generation electronics. In its place, under a stretch nose, were 5 Amira 31 cameras designed to give full coverage ahead, below, or on either side of the aircraft. The system could be aligned depending on the altitude that the mission was being flown and the required coverage. There was also a setup that allowed for operation under parachute flares at night. Those flares were carried in tubes where the regular Mirage III had its cannon pack, and they were ejected downwards. The first 3R flew on the 31st of October 1961, and 50 were immediately ordered, entering service in February 1963. In between times, a new version of the 3R was developed, incorporating some of the advanced features found in the Mirage III-E, most notably a Marconi Doppler navigation radar in the blister under the nose behind the cameras. This enabled all-weather operation, and when combined with a new automated camera control system and an infrared camera under the fuselage, represented a step change in the aircraft's potential. 20 of these Mirage 3Ds were duly ordered, and they entered service from April 68. They served exclusively with the 3rd Squadron of the 33rd Reconnaissance Wing based at Strasbourg, who used the type until the summer of 1986. The sophisticated Mirage III-E took longer to develop. Its first production version didn't fly until January 14, 1964, and the type didn't enter squadron service until April 1965. 183 was supplied to the Army de l'Air, serving in 4 wings until 1994. Such was its capability set and versatility that a total of 523 were built for France and its export customers. The first to show interest were the Swiss, who test flew an early 3A in January 1960. This led to an order for 100 aircraft being placed in 1961. They were to be built under license by FFA, with the engines built by Sulzer. As was the norm for export customers, the Swiss specified a different avionics setup. In this case, they wanted the Hughes Tactical Attack and Navigation System, or TARAN, in place of the Mirage's French navigation and fire control systems. Part of the reason for this was a desire to arm the Mirage with Hughes's excellent aim for Falcon semi-active radar homing missile. I will leave you to mull over that decision at your leisure. Sidewinders could also be carried, as could the French AS-30 air-to-surface missile. Matra 530 was not an option, so the Swiss Mirages had a maximum engagement range less than half that of the French aircraft. Avionics were tested on a modified Mirage III-C, designated the 3CS. Another change concerned the strength of the airframe and the landing gear. The Swiss intended to operate their aircraft from a network of underground bunkers and hangars in mountains. This meant that the aircraft would routinely be winched and craned about the place and needed to be pretty robust. Once airborne, they'd also have to climb very rapidly, increasing the G-load on the aircraft and meaning that rocket-assisted takeoff equipment was regularly used. Costs of this new design rose to the extent that only 56 were made of the original 100. All production Swiss Mirages were based on the 3E family. The first was delivered in 1964 as the Mirage IIIs. All but 2 of the 36 fighters that were built were made in Switzerland. The balance of the aircraft were 18 RS Reconnaissance variants, also based on the 3E but with a different nose and an under-fuselage pod that added rear cameras. All but 1 of these were made in Switzerland. 6 BS 2-seaters were also delivered in 3 lots of 2, the first in 1963, then in 1972, and then finally a pair in 1983. The Swiss operated their Mirages for an extended period. In 1985, their remaining 30 single-seaters were upgraded with Canard 4 planes based on those of the Kafir. Upgraded defensive systems included integrated chaff and flare dispensers were added, and the ejection seat was updated to a 0-0 type. These modified aircraft served until their replacement with FA-18 Hornets in 1999. A handful of similarly upgraded RS models carried on until 2003. The next country to come and look at the Mirage was Australia. In the late 1950s, the RAAF was looking for a replacement for its Avon-powered Sabres. An Australian delegation thus visited Dassault in June 1960 to take a look at the new Mirage, placing an order for initial 30 aircraft in October. Although licensed producing the American Sabre had seen Australia break from its exclusive relationship with British manufacturers, its military harboured a strong pro-British lobby. They also, it would be fair to say, liked a hot rod. The Australian Mirage III was therefore to be powered by the £16,000 Force Rolls-Royce Avon Mark 67 and have the Ferranti Airpass 2 radar and fire control system that was in the English Electric Lightning. In fairness, this was a better system than Cyrano, but it lacked an effective long-range missile to pair it with. A single Mirage IIIA was refitted with the alternative engine. I actually can't find a record of which of the 10 prototypes this was, unfortunately, so if you know, please let me know in the comments. The engine fit well and only small modifications were required to install it. But despite increasing thrust by 20%, performance was little different, and it was decided not to pursue this option. The order thus shifted to an ATAR 9C powered version of the Mirage IIIe equipped with Cyrano 2 but with many other avionics changes, including deletion of the terrain following radar. 100 of these were ordered alongside 10 two-seat Mirage 3Ds. 50 of the single-seaters were to the 30F standard with an air-to-air only Cyrano 2A radar, and the remainder were to the 30A with the fully featured 2B version of Cyrano. The latter was analogous to the French 3E, and ultimately all of the F model aircraft were rebuilt as A's so that they could act as multi-role fighters. In order to sustain the Australian aviation industry, airframes were built at the Government Aircraft Factory and engines at the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, both in Melbourne. The first 2 aircraft were built by Dassault and they were delivered in April 1963, followed by the first Australian examples in November. Production was relatively slow, with the last aircraft delivered in December 1968. They served until 1988, when they were replaced by Hornets, and almost all of them were then sold to Pakistan. Although it was an attractive proposition on the international arms market, the 3E was really too sophisticated for most customers. who wanted, in the words of a Colombian general, a macho Mach 2 aircraft, but not a maintenance headache. Dassault had also observed the Israeli experience in the desert with great interest. Although all-weather and nocturnal operations were all the rage, in reality, actually executing such attacks required a high level of target location information, command and control that was beyond almost every military organization, and a degree of pilot skill which only the very best air arms had. Likewise, beyond visual range attacks on other aircraft sounded good, but in practice the exorbitant cost and dubious effectiveness of the weapons made BVR basically irrelevant over most late 1960s battlefields. These observations were brought into clear focus when in the mid-1960s the Israeli government came to Dassault to ask for a version of the Mirage IIIe that was stripped of its advanced electronics and radar. They proposed that the space and weight saved could be used to carry more fuel and external ordnance. A study into this requirement began in early July 1965. It determined that removing the avionics and radar would shed £1,000 off the £15,500 empty weight of the Mirage IIIe. It would also knock $200,000 off the approximately $1.7 million price and reduce the number of maintenance hours required. To make the aircraft, the dielectric radar nose cone was replaced by a 1.5 foot longer needle nose that improved aerodynamics. A simple gun-ranging radar was fitted beneath it, feeding information to the CSF-97 sight, which displayed air-to-air and air-to-ground targeting information. An extra pair of pylons were mounted beneath the main undercarriage at the junction of the wing and fuselage. The total potential weapons load was still £8,800, though. An additional 545 litres of fuel could be carried in the space vacated by the Avionics, increasing fuel capacity by a third. Because it was lighter at combat weight, it accelerated faster than the 3E, turned more tightly, and was still armed with the same cannons and either Magic or Sidewinder missiles. The Israeli government signed a contract for 50 of these newly designated Mirage IVs on April 7, 1966. But in 1967, the de Gaulle government placed an arms embargo on the country, preventing shipment of the Mirages. The aircraft were eventually adopted by the Armée de l'Air as the Mirage 5F. The Israelis received a refund in 1971 and eventually would produce 50 of their own Nesher, which is a subject for another day. Mirage 5s were produced in a bewildering array of versions. The basic ones were the two-seat 5D and the reconnaissance-equipped 5R, but there were also several radar-equipped versions including the 5E Interceptor. These often benefited from more modern electronics that were smaller than the Cyrano 2 but offered similar capabilities. 13 countries would end up using Mirage 5. Rather than going through all of them, I'll just highlight the more interesting ones. In Europe, Belgium decided to purchase Mirages to replace their F-84F Thunderstreaks in 1968. As they were replacing CAS and Strike aircraft, the Belgians decided to buy the radarless Mirage 5 rather than the more expensive 3. Belgian aircraft were largely made in Belgium, and they used US-produced avionics to simplify the training of ground crews and widen supply chains. The Belgians would also buy 27 BR reconnaissance models. Although it auditioned for many air arms, other than Switzerland, Spain was the only other European customer for the Mirage 3 or 5. They acquired 24 export standard radar-equipped Es and half a dozen two-seaters in 1970. Speaking of radar-equipped aircraft, the most significant systems on offer by the French were the Cyrano 4 from the Mirage F1 and the Tonson Agave, a version of Cyrano 4 that was optimized for maritime strike. The then new Exocet was the main armament of this version. Pakistan was probably the archetypal user of these aircraft. As well as export standard Mirage 3s, they also bought 28 Mirage 5s without radar, 28 with Cyrano 4 and 12 with Agave. Later down the line, they hoovered up a range of aircraft on the second-hand market, including the Australian Mirage III fleet. Some of these were eventually fitted with glass cockpits, FLIR, and night vision goggles. Remarkably, the PAF still operates 80 Mirage 3s and 90 Mirage 5s. After Israel, the most prominent combat user of the Mirage III family were the Argentines, who flew the type against the British Task Force in 1982. I'm going to stick to my promise and not talk about the J-79 equipped Dagger just now. The radar-equipped Mirage 3s flew as part top cover and part decoy for the Daggers and Skyhawks that attacked on the deck every day. They didn't tangle with the Sea Harriers, and they were not able to prevent those aircraft shooting down numerous Argentine aircraft. But then the Sea Harriers were also unable to prevent 5 warships and the converted merchantman Atlantic Conveyor being sunk and others being hit and damaged to various degrees. On the other side of the world, with its aviators having been tormented by Israeli Mirages for a generation, Egypt operated a range of Mirage IVs in the 70s. They initially borrowed 20 or so radarless and 20 Cyrano II radar-equipped aircraft in 1973, all of which from Libya. They had actually ordered 36 aircraft of their own via a middleman in Saudi Arabia during 1972, but these weren't available in October 1973. They formed the core of the Egyptian fighter force after the war. Another 16 of those were delivered in the late 1970s. Small numbers of trainer and recon versions operated alongside them. One of the Egyptian aircraft was shot down on the 14th of March 1986 by an Iranian F-14 Tomcat using a single AIM-9 Sidewinder. Since Mirage IVs were still being sold and were still widely operated in the latter half of the 1970s, Dassault decided to offer an upgraded version for those who didn't want the additional expense of the F1. This added an uprated 9K50 version of the ATAR, which upped power to 15,900 pounds of force. The new engine ran cooler so it could operate at higher power levels for longer, and it had reduced fuel consumption. Better thrust reduced the takeoff roll by 20%, increased acceleration and reduced the climb rate. This was the Mirage 50. It was offered with agave for strike or the multi-role Cyrano 4. Although it was a major upgrade, it also fell between two stools generationally. Only 24 were produced, for Chile in 1982 and Venezuela in 1989. Alongside this, in 1981, Dassault also began to study a much more advanced version. This was the Mirage III NG. It would ultimately feature a Mirage 2000 fly-by-wire control system as well as leading-edge route extensions and canard foreplanes. It flew for the first time in April 1988 as the Mirage III EX, but by then the days of the old Mirage III airframe had passed and no orders were forthcoming. In total, 1,400 Mirage III, 5 and 50 aircraft were built. They represent the most successful French military aircraft from an export perspective since the First World War. Its contemporaries in the medium-weight Mach II class of the late 1950s were the American F-104 Starfighter, the British Lightning and the Soviet MiG-21. Curiously, the Mirage's performance stands out in the same way from all three. Relative lack of thrust to weight means that the other three machines all accelerate and climb much more rapidly, but greater wing area gives the Mirage better initial turn rate and it's generally superior in a horizontal fight. The combination of Cyrano and Matra R530 was the best BVR system of this company, but it was predictably unreliable. Only one kill was ever scored with the 420-pound weapon by a Mirage III against a MiG-19 on the 29th of November 1966, and for the record, the kill was scored from within a 1-mile range. The Mirage IIIe was probably the best strike aircraft of the four, with neither the MiG or the Lightning having any air-to-ground capability of note. The F-104G Starfighter was in the same sort of broad class, but one has to wonder whether the Luftwaffe regretted their decision to take the Lockheed fighter, although the combination of low price and considerable transfer of industrial know-how was very attractive, and it's been enduringly useful. Mirage 5 lacked some of the top-end all-weather capabilities of the three, but it was cheaper and easier to maintain. Its great popularity with smaller air arms is illustrative of its appeal. Ultimately, the Mirage III family was one of the most successful and effective fighter families of the Cold War. If it wasn't for the F-4 Phantom, then it would likely be regarded as the best third-generation fighter all told, including its own successor, the more single-minded but also very effective Mirage F1. I'm sure that statement may cause some controversy, so I shall leave the video there. Thanks for watching.